Welcome back to another deep dive. This time, we're headed to eastern France. It's a region nestled between Burgundy and Switzerland. You might know Burgundy for their wines, but have you ever heard of Jura? It's a place where you can find some really unique wines. Wines made with grapes you won't find anywhere else.
Jura is fascinating. It really shows what terroir is all about. I know that can sound kind of complicated. So think about it this way. It's about how a place's natural elements, things like the climate, soil, and geography, all work together to give a wine its flavor.
So what you're saying is, when I take a sip of Jura wine, it's like I'm tasting a bit of the region itself.
Exactly, and the Jura Mountains are a big part of shaping that landscape. They act like a natural shield, creating these microclimates all over the region, warmer weather in one spot, a little more rain in another, and all of that has an impact on how the grapes grow and taste.
That's incredible, and I've heard the soil in Jura is pretty special too.
Oh, it definitely is. It's really diverse. You've got limestone, marl, clay, and alluvial soils all mixed together, and each of these soils adds something special to the wine. For example, limestone is known for making the wines taste bright and mineral. It's almost like tasting wet stone, while clay soils usually give you richer, fuller-bodied wines.
Wow. So just from the soil alone, you can taste the difference. We've got these cool microclimates, this blend of different soils. It sounds like the perfect mix for some seriously interesting wines. But let's talk about the grapes themselves.
You'll actually find some grapes you might already know in Jura, like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But even those have a special Jura character. They're not your typical Burgundy Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, for instance. Jura Chardonnay tends to be less buttery and oaky. It's often more mineral, almost like a taste of wet stone, which comes directly from that limestone soil we talked about.
That's amazing. What about those rare grapes unique to Jura?
Yes. Let's start with Pulsard. It's sometimes called Ploussard. It's a red grape, and it's like the signature grape of Jura. It makes these light, fruity wines. They're almost the opposite of a big, bold Cabernet Sauvignon. Think of delicate aromas of fresh red berries, strawberries, cherries, and sometimes even a little bit of white pepper. They're the perfect wines to chill slightly and enjoy on a warm day.
Oh, that sounds delicious. I can already picture myself sipping that on a patio somewhere in the Jura Mountains.
And then there's Trousseau. If you want something with a little more power, this grape makes full-bodied red wines. They have grippy tannins, like that feeling you get when you sip black tea. And it has complex aromas of spice and dark fruit. It's a wine that can age for a really long time, and some even for a decade or more.
So we've got light and fruity, rich and age-worthy. Jura Reds really do cover it all. But what about the white wines? I've heard there's something called Vin Jaune that's really special.
Finjon, or yellow wine. It's made from Savagnin. It's considered the queen of Jura's white grapes. And it really is unique. It's aged for over 6 years under a veil of yeast. We call that technique ouge. Basically, the barrels aren't filled all the way, which lets this layer of yeast form on top. It's kind of like a protective blanket. And that yeast is what gives Vin Jaune its incredible aromas. Nutty, spicy, almost like curry.
6 years under a blanket of yeast. That's quite a process. I'm starting to understand why people are so crazy about it.
Yeah.
But with all these different grapes and styles, how do you even begin to understand Jura wines?
Well, it might seem overwhelming at first, but it helps to think about them in terms of their styles. For reds, you have that range from the lighter Pulsard to the bolder Trousseau, and you'll find some elegant Pinot Noirs too. The main appellations or wine regions within Jura for those red wines are Côte de Jura and Ardois.
So those are like the main spots where you'd find those styles.
Exactly. For white wines, it gets even more interesting. You have everything from fresh and mineral Chardonnay, which often comes from the Côte de Jura, to more complex and aromatic Sauvignons, especially from L'Etoile, an area known for its unique vineyards shaped like stars.
Star-shaped vineyards. That sounds amazing.
And then, of course, there's Chateau Chalon, which is completely dedicated to making Vin Jaune. It really shows how special and treasured that wine is.
Wow. So each grape has its own little area in
Yeah.
Jura, and then you have these appellations, these regions known for specific styles. It's like a delicious puzzle.
Exactly. And we haven't even talked about Jura's other surprises. They make rosé wines, sparkling Crémant du Jura, and even fortified wines like Vin du Jura and Vin de Paix.
Hold on, fortified wines too. So Jura really does have something for everyone.
Absolutely. And the best part is, all of these wines pair so well with the local cuisine. Imagine yourself in a cozy Jura restaurant, enjoying creamy chicken with a glass of chilled Pulsard, or maybe a hearty stew with a glass of aged Trousseau.
My mouth is watering already. But I'm curious, how do the winemakers in Jura create such a variety of wines? What are their secrets?
Well, a lot of it has to do with their respect for tradition and their willingness to try new things. They're known for being very meticulous, especially when it comes to the harvest. Many of them still pick the grapes by hand, carefully choosing only the best bunches to make sure the wine is top quality.
That sounds like a lot of work, especially with those steep slopes in Jura. It can't be easy to use machines there.
You're right. And it's not just about the terrain. Hand harvesting lets the winemakers look at each bunch of grapes, so they can pick only the ripe and healthy ones. It's that level of attention and detail that really makes Jura wine special.
Welcome back to our Jura adventure. We've talked about terroir, the grapes, and a little bit how they make wine in Jura. But now, I'm ready to really dive into what happens in the cellar. What exactly are the winemakers doing to make Jura wines so special?
Well, like we talked about before, tradition is really important in Jura. They've been making wine there for centuries, and some of those old techniques are still used today.
Okay, so give me an example. What's a traditional method that really makes Jura different?
One of the most interesting things about Jura winemaking is how they've mastered oxidative wines. And by that, I mean wines that are exposed to oxygen while they're being made.
I think I've heard of that before. But it sounds a little strange, doesn't it?
Oh.
Don't we usually want to keep oxygen away from wine?
For the most part, yes. Too much oxygen can ruin a wine. But in Jura, they use it in a very controlled way to get some incredible flavors.
Okay, you've got me curious. So how does this oxidative thing work?
Well, the most famous example is Vin Jaune. We talked about that earlier. You remember how it's aged for 6 years under that layer of yeast? That's a big part of the oxidative process.
Right, you said they don't fill the barrels all the way up, and that lets the yeast form on top. But how does that oxidize the wine?
The yeast doesn't make a totally airtight seal. It actually lets a very small amount of oxygen in. And that oxygen interacts with the wine as it ages.
So it's like the yeast is a filter and only lets a tiny bit of oxygen through.
Exactly. And that slow oxidation is what gives Vin Jaune those unique flavors, those nutty, spicy, almost curry-like notes.
That's amazing. Something that might be considered a problem in other wines is actually a key part of some of Jura's most famous wines.
Exactly. And Vin Jaune isn't the only oxidative wine they make in Jura. There's also Vin de Paille. It's made with grapes that are dried on straw mats. That way their sugars and flavors get more concentrated.
Straw mats, like the ones you see at the beach.
Exactly like those. The grapes are laid out on these mats for weeks, sometimes months, and that drying process really intensifies their flavors. Then they're pressed and fermented, and often aged in an oxidative way as well. The result is a rich, sweet wine with notes of dried fruits, honey, and spices.
Okay, I'm adding Vin de Paille to my list of wines to try. But let's go back to some of the other traditional techniques they use in Jura. You mentioned manual harvesting before, right?
Oh, definitely. Many of the winemakers in Jura still harvest their grapes by hand, even though it takes a lot more work. They believe that it lets them choose the very best fruit, which makes sure their wines are the highest quality.
That makes sense. Those steep slopes in Jura don't seem very easy for machines.
You're right. And it's not just about the terrain. Hand harvesting lets them look at each bunch of grapes. They can pick out only the grapes that are ripe and healthy. It's that kind of care and detail that really sets Jura wines apart.
So we've got these ancient oxidative techniques, and they're hand harvesting the grapes. Tradition is definitely a big deal in Jura. But you also said that there's some innovation in the region. Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. Jura winemakers have a lot of respect for their traditions, but they're also not afraid to experiment and try new things. And one of the most exciting things happening in Jura right now is the rise of natural winemaking.
I've heard about natural wine before, but to be honest, I'm not really sure what it means. What does it mean in Jura?
It's all about not interfering too much. Natural winemakers want to let the grapes and the terroir speak for themselves, so they don't use any herbicides or pesticides in the vineyards.
So they're really trying to work with nature?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
in the cellar, they use very few additives, if any at all. They avoid things like commercial yeasts and rely on the natural yeasts that are already on the grapes and in the winery. They also try to use as little sulfur dioxide as possible, or they don't use it at all. Sulfur dioxide is something that's often used to preserve wine.
So it's like a back-to-basics approach to winemaking.
That's a great way to put it. And the result is wines that are pure, expressive, and really show the unique character of the grapes and where they're from.
It sounds like natural winemaking fits perfectly with Jura's philosophy, respecting tradition and showcasing the terroir. Are there any particular winemakers in Jura who are leading the way in natural wine?
Oh, absolutely. One that comes to mind is Pierre Auvernois. We mentioned him earlier. He's considered a pioneer of natural winemaking, not just in Jura, but all over the world. He's been doing this for decades, and his wines are incredibly sought after because they're so pure and intense.
It sounds like he's a true legend in the natural wine world. Are there any other natural winemakers in Jura that we should know about?
So many. Natural winemaking has really become popular in Jura, and there's a new generation of winemakers who are following in Overnoy's footsteps. They're pushing the boundaries and making some really exciting wines.
It's great to see how they're honoring the past and, at the same time, creating a more sustainable and authentic way to make wine.
Yeah.
As we're talking, I'm realizing that Jura is a region of contrasts, ancient techniques alongside modern ideas, powerful wines next to the delicate ones, rugged mountains alongside gentle vineyards.
It's that contrast, that balance between tradition and innovation that really makes Jura so captivating. And you see it not just in the wines, but in the landscape, the culture, the people.
You've really painted a vivid picture of Jura. I almost feel like I've already been there. But before we move on, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned about how they make wine in Jura. We've talked about some really interesting techniques, from the old practice of oxidative winemaking to the newer trend of natural wines. And all of it is based on respecting the land and wanting to create wines that truly express the character of Jura. But stay tuned, because next, we're going to leave the cellar and explore the heart of Jura, its vineyards and villages, its history and culture. We'll go back. We've covered the terroir and the grapes. We've even peeked into the cellar and learned how they make wine in Jura. Now, I'm ready for the tour. Let's talk about actually experiencing Jura. Where should we go? What should we see? And most importantly, what should we eat and drink while we're there?
You'll want to wear your comfy shoes. There's so much to discover. Arbois is a great place to start. It's like the center of the Jura wine world, with history going all the way back to Roman times. You can wander through the medieval streets. They're so charming. You can stop by local wine bars to taste all the different wines Jura has to offer. You could even visit Louis Pasteur's house.
Wait, Louis Pasteur, the famous scientist, what does he have to do with Jura?
Well, Pasteur was actually born in Jura, and he spent a good chunk of his life there. His family even owned a vineyard in Arbois. And get this, some of his big discoveries about fermentation came from studying Jura wines.
Wow, Jura really is full of surprises. Okay, so Arbois is on the list. Where else should we go?
If you're looking for stunning views,
Yeah.
and you want to try Jura's most famous wine, then you have to visit Chateau Chalon. It's this little village up on a cliff with amazing views of all the vineyards around it. And remember how we talked about Vengeance? Well, Chateau Chalon is the place to go for that, with that special aging process and those incredible flavors.
Okay, Chateau Chalon is definitely going on the itinerary. Those clifftop views sound amazing. But what about those star-shaped vineyards you mentioned before?
Ah, yes. Those are in L'Etoile. It's another fantastic area, known for making exceptional Chardonnay. These wines are so crisp and mineral-driven. They truly showcase the terroir.
So much to see and taste. It sounds like we need more than just a quick trip to really experience everything Jura has to offer.
You're absolutely right. And we can't forget about the food. Jura is a cheese lover's dream. Have you ever tried Comté? It's a hard cheese with a nutty flavor. They age it for months, so it develops this really complex taste. It's considered one of the best cheeses in France, and it goes perfectly with many Jura wines, especially the oxidative styles like Vengeance and Van de Pey.
I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. What other culinary adventures should we look for in Jura?
Well, besides Comté, you have Morbier. It has that cool stripe of ash running through it. It's a bit milder than Comté, with an earthier flavor. And if you're feeling adventurous, there's Bleu de Gex. It's a blue cheese, really pungent and sharp. Definitely not for everyone, but it's a true taste of Jura.
I'm getting the feeling that the food in Jura is just as diverse and interesting as the wines.
Absolutely. And they complement each other so well. Just imagine yourself sitting at a table overlooking the vineyards, enjoying a plate of local cheeses, sipping a glass of Jura wine, breathing in the fresh mountain air. It's an experience you'll never forget.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Jura wine region. We hope you've enjoyed the trip. It's been amazing to explore the history of Jura, the terroir, the grapes, and even the food that makes this region so special.
Jura wines are truly unique. They're expressive and complex. They're deeply connected to the land and the people who make them.
So next time you're looking for a new wine to try, think beyond the usual. Consider a bottle of Jura wine. It's a chance to taste history, to experience a different side of France, and maybe even discover your new favorite wine.
And who knows, maybe one day you'll find yourself in Jura, wandering through those beautiful villages, sipping on a glass of Vengeance, and taking in the incredible views. It's an adventure worth having.
Until next time, Cheers to exploring the world of wine, one sip at a time.